Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks to the students for inviting me to do this. Always interesting to talk with anybody, but especially students, about elements of academic work that sometimes are difficult to understand, or where you don't quite know where to begin, or how you kind of get yourself out of a project like a literature review. So we're going to talk about several things today. This is kind of an outline, and I'll be happy to take questions too at the end of the presentation, and you may certainly have some. So I'm going to begin with something that seems fairly straightforward, and that's just a few definitions of what a literature review is, because contained within these definitions are some key concepts that I'll be coming back to later in the presentation. The purposes, the stages or steps in doing reviews, and we're going to talk about we're going to look at a set of steps, but with the warning that there's nothing stepwise about doing a literature review. It's often very iterative, and you kind of jump around quite a bit. It makes it look like it's a very organized process, but it hasn't ever been for me, and it probably won't be for you either. What different readers expect to see, and we're focusing really on this, talking about literature reviews from a reviewer's perspective, and there could be several different kinds of reviewers, including professors in your courses, could be committee members, it could be external examiners, depending on what kind of a program you're in. It could be journal editors or journal reviewers, and book reviewers and others. It all depends on what the reason is for doing the literature review, who's going to be looking at it. So I'm going to be talking about literature reviews with those kind of viewpoints in mind, that there are going to be people looking at your review and critiquing it at some point and making judgments about it. So we'll be talking about what makes for a really outstanding literature review and some of the problems to avoid as well. So we'll be looking at common weaknesses. I've got some resources that are included in here if you want to study more about literature reviews. And assuming we have time at the end, a short personal story about literature reviews that I hope might be helpful. Okay. So you can find quite a few different definitions of literature reviews in the literature, and I just picked a few to illustrate some of the key elements of literature reviews that are important for you to be thinking about as you're developing yours. So this one, it's an evaluative report, and that's an important phrase there, an evaluative report of information found related to your selected area of study. And I've highlighted some other key concepts here. So it's descriptive, it's summative, it's evaluative, and that you're not just reporting, but you're also making judgments about the literature, and you're clarifying this literature for people who may not be as familiar with it as you are. So those are some key features in this definition. Another definition, we see some similar ideas showing up. It's a critical and in-depth evaluation of previous research. So again, we get to the critical and in-depth evaluation of the literature. And so it's more than just reporting what the literature has to say, it's also assessing that literature for quality. It's a summary and synopsis of a particular area of research so that anybody reading it is able to understand why you're pursuing your particular research project. And a good literature review expands upon the reasons behind selecting a particular research question. So especially if this is embedded in a thesis, for example, you want your literature review to naturally lead up to, or to naturally explain why it is that you picked the research question that you picked. It kind of situates your study in relation to a broader conversation that's been going on in the literature. This one's a bit wordy, but I added it because it has the phrase that I haven't read here, organizational pattern. So a literature review can be a simple summary of the sources, and I say not at UBC, meaning that we don't accept literature reviews that stop there. We expect more than that, so I just wanted to note that. It can be a simple summary, but and very often people confuse annotated bibliographies with literature reviews, and that's a very important distinction to make. You might produce an annotated bibliography in preparation for doing a more elaborate literature review, but it's just a step on the way. It's a way for you to kind of capture the main ideas in a body of something you've read, but then you have to worry about all these other things like the summary, synthesis, new interpretation. A literature review can trace the intellectual progression of the field or an area within the field. It may include and discuss major debates in that field and alternative perspectives. Okay? So you're evaluating the sources and you're advising the reader on the most pertinent or relevant aspects of the literature that you're looking at. So you're trying to bring the reader into a conversation. And one of the ways of doing that is to use your voice in your writing to help the reader understand why you're assessing the literature the way you are, why you selected the literature you selected, how you went about selecting it, and so on. So we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. Now, the phrase in red up there, organizational pattern, is important because some drafts of literature reviews that I've seen, I use the metaphor of a passenger on a speeding train. You're kind of sitting on a train that's speeding through the countryside, and you kind of look out the window and all you see is a blur. You don't see any of the detail. And some literature reviews are like that, where the student will kind of go from one piece of literature to another without kind of pausing to consolidate or to help the reader understand what the meaning is or what the most important elements are of the things that are being read. And so it's important to have an organizational pattern where there's a kind of a logical flow to your literature review, and we'll talk about different ways of organizing a literature review in just a minute. But what I also always expect from students is that either at various points in the literature review, you stop periodically and help the reader kind of catch up with what you think is important. You might have a section, and at the end of that section, and it might deal with a particular theoretical position or body of research that focuses on a particular question. And instead of just moving to the next set of literature without kind of stopping and consolidating, you provide a summary. You kind of help the reader understand what was significant about the literature that you reviewed in that section and what kind of fundamental ideas they should carry forward in their minds as they read the rest of the review. Okay? And in some cases, people do that at different points in the review. In other cases, they would have a summary at the end of the review where they kind of they go back and they point out the major ideas, perspectives, debates, and so on that are particularly relevant for the study that they're going to be doing. Okay? But at some point in the literature review, it's important to provide that summary for the reader. Okay? Now, there are different ways of picturing a literature review, and you can, if you're interested in reading more about these, you can go to these original sources, and we will make the PowerPoint available in addition to, in the recording, we'll make it available separately if you want to look at some of these references in more detail. So this author talked about kind of 4 different ways of picturing a literature review. The zooming approach, where you kind of start wide and then you go more narrow. So it depends on what your research question is and what the body of literature looks like that relates to that. Sometimes it's important to kind of start out broadly, contextualizing the whole area of study, maybe providing a bit of a historical analysis, and then you gradually move in to more and more detailed literature that focuses as close as possible to the kind of research question that you're posing. Okay, finding intersections is another approach. Sometimes it's really difficult to find literature specifically on the area that you're studying. And in that case, you might often look at a variety of several different bodies of literature and then talk about intersections among these bodies of literature, right? So that's the dark area in the diagram there. And your study may have very little research that's been done on it, partly because there aren't a lot of people that are looking at that intersection space. And so yours could be quite unique. Again, there may not be a lot of work on it, but you might be able to find some literature that's relevant to what you're doing in these other, in this case, 3 bodies of work. Okay? Patchworking. This is a little bit different. You might be pulling several different ideas together and forming your own conception, okay? But in that case, when you're doing patchworking, you really need to help the reader understand why you've selected the different pieces of this puzzle and how they fit together, okay? You don't want to leave it to the reader to make sense of several different bodies of literature. You need to help them understand in what way you're putting them together as a foundation for the work that you're going to be doing. And the funneling approach, as you can kind of tell, there might be a fairly large body of work out there, but you narrow it down fairly quickly into the specific areas that you're going to be looking at. But there could be a huge amount of work in an area you're looking at, and you have to make decisions about which ones of those you're going to be focusing on for purposes of your study. Okay, there could be other ways of kind of picturing what a literature review looks like and how it can be organized, but these are some that I found useful.
So, Tom, what's the difference between the zooming and the funneling?
Well, I think they're very similar. I interpret the funneling approach. Is that the one you're talking about, zooming and funneling? I think they're very similar. The point is that you're starting more broadly, and I think the funneling process is one where you may have a huge body of literature, and what you have to do is narrow that down to the parts that are most relevant to what you're doing, right? I'm thinking more of, in zooming, I'm thinking more that the wide view would be a broad contextualization of an area of work or a problem and how that problem has been addressed in various ways. And then you have the medium view where you say, now, I'm interested in this particular aspect of this problem, and so I'm not going to talk about all this other work that's been done in this area. I'm going to talk about maybe work that's been done using a particular methodology or a particular theoretical framework and so on. And then you would get down to the narrow, the very specific studies that are directly relevant to what you're doing. So they're similar. Again, a lot of the kind of conceptions that we find in social science research in particular, the boundaries aren't always as clear as we'd like them to be between one and another. So this is just, you can kind of define these in the way that's helpful to you as well. So the purposes of literature reviews, you might do literature reviews for a variety of reasons. One, to answer the question, what do we know or not know about this particular topic, issue, or subject? So you might be looking at a body of literature because what you're trying to do is to basically say at the end, here's what we think we know, but here's a gap. Here's an area that I want my work to fit into because it addresses a void in the larger literature. The survey summarize, assess, and distill information about a topic. Again, that's to demonstrate your knowledge, to demonstrate that you've done the background work and the reading that's necessary so that you have a good command of the subject. Position you as a well-informed, authoritative participant in a scholarly conversation. So you're trying to also indicate how your work fits within this larger conversation. And you're trying to convince your committee that you've read enough, you've read widely enough and deeply enough so that they think you're ready to go ahead. If they don't see in your literature review evidence of that, then they might tell you you've got more work to do. Or they might suggest other theorists or other bodies of work, more recent work, older work, classic work to look at, just to deepen your understanding of what's been done in that area. So you're trying to establish an intellectual foundation for a research project. You're trying to convince others you are sufficiently engaged with a body of relevant literature to propose an original research project. Okay. Now, this is the diagram I was mentioning. It makes it look like producing a literature review is kind of a happy, systematic, linear process. And that's never been my experience. It's always very messy. So it's an attractive graphic, but there's nothing linear about producing a good literature review. However, the review itself and good reviews make it look like it was the product of a linear process because you're kind of presenting it in such an organized way that the person reading it says, oh, well, this is really a nice way of organizing all of this. But that's the case with any research project. The way we report research projects always look tidier than the project actually was. Okay? Now, as I said, as indicated in the title, I'm looking at this from a reviewer's perspective, And different reviewers are going to have different magnifying glasses when they look at your review. The lenses are somewhat different. And so, for example, when you send it, if you send a literature review to a journal, let's say you want to get your review published in a journal, those magnifying glasses are going to represent the editorial team, the review committee, and so on. And each of them is going to look at, because they do this independently, they're each going to be likely going to be looking for different things. Okay? So one of the things you may have experienced already, if you're working with a committee, is that your committee may also give you different advice, and they might focus on different things in your literature review, right? Because each of us has our own kind of way of reading through a literature review and a list of items in our head that we expect to see in a literature review. So don't be surprised or frustrated too much if you get different reactions from different committee members. Okay? We have, as academics, we have to get used to getting reviews of the things we submit back from journals with very different takes on what we've submitted, very different judgments about what we submitted, and different suggestions about how to improve our work. So we have to figure out ways to kind of cope with the varied advice that we get, and your advisor can help with that if you're experiencing that as well. Okay? Now, some things readers may look for in your review. How clear is the question, issue, topic, or purpose of the review? So have you started the review with a clear description of what it is you're looking at? Why are you looking at this literature? What question are you trying to get an answer to? How well does the review contextualize historically, intellectually, your study? So when the person reads through this, they should really understand how you're thinking about where your work fits in this broader conversation. How detailed is the description of how the literature was selected? And sometimes people skip over this. They don't explain how they went about finding the literature. And that becomes very important, especially if the person reading it realizes that you've left something out. And often when you explain how you went about doing a literature review, it's clear to them why you left it out, and that for them that may be a flaw that needs to be corrected. So usually in a few sentences you can explain, and I'll give you some examples of how people explain very briefly how they went about identifying literature. How relevant and current is the literature selected? How well have you surfaced the assumptions, paradigms, worldviews behind the literature? Sometimes it becomes very important to talk about, if there's a body of research you're looking at, what the kind of epistemological grounding is that people were operating from when they did this research, or what assumptions are made in the research that you're looking at. How well have you shown the historical trajectory of the conceptual, theoretical, and empirical developments? In some areas, and I'll show you one that I've been involved in some areas, it's really important to look at the way that area of work has changed over time. New ideas, new perspectives come into play, and often tend to shift the character of the work that's done at different points in history. So it's important to look not just at what the current perspectives are and what the current literature says, but also to get a sense of how the thinking about that area and how the research approaches in that area have changed over time. A few more things. How carefully have you assessed the quality of the material selected for review? And we're going to look at one faculty member's framework for the kind of literature that they would hope would be the foundation for your literature review, and the kind of material that you can find on the web and other places that they don't want to see in a literature review, which some people feel pretty strongly about certain sources to avoid. Okay? What contrasting perspectives have you included, and how have you treated them? It's tempting when you want to take a particular position in relation to the work that's done or to a problem to focus on the people that agree with you, that kind of support the direction that you want to go in. But it's very important to also identify contrasting viewpoints. It's important to bring out debates and critiques that have been done of the position that you might want to adopt. but it's very dangerous to adopt a position and not know or to let other people know that you're aware of what these controversies have been and how these different perspectives have played across one another and influenced one another. Okay. How strong or clear is your voice or presence in the review? This is something that is quite, I think, typical these days in social science research, that it's important for us to hear your voice. How effectively have you analyzed the material? And how well have you synthesized the material? And again, that's this process that I talked about earlier, where you stop, you pause from time to time as you're writing this, and you consolidate, you bring together the main ideas that you're going to be moving forward with for the benefit of the reader. Don't leave it up to the reader to make sense of why it is you're including literature in a particular area. Okay, some common weaknesses that I've seen and that are described in the literature on literature reviews. No information on how the search was conducted. That's, for many people, kind of an important omission. And so think about concise ways of explaining to the reader how it is you went about doing your search. No information on the criteria for including or excluding literature. Some people are very clear. They talk about, for example, a time period, that they're limiting their search to a particular time period or to certain kinds of journals or certain kinds of publications and so on. You have to be able to justify the criteria that you do use. And so there could be some debate about that among the people who are looking at your work. But it is important to be as clear as you can about why it is that you included and excluded certain literature. Lack of clarity or the definitions of the key concepts used. Also, one of the features of social science, of the social sciences and education in general, is that sometimes terms are used in many different ways. And so if you're using these key concepts as a basis for your search, whether you're using Google Scholar or the search systems that are available through the library or other means, it's important that you understand that the concepts you use do need to be defined. And you may find that literature will pop up when you do these searches, and they're using terms in a completely different way than you are, right? And so that's why it's important for you to be clear about the meaning of those terms in relation to your own study, and then to be able to sort out the literature that's relevant, because it has the same, that literature reflects the same understanding of the key concepts that you're going to be using. It's also fine to talk about how definitions of key concepts have changed over time, or how people's conceptions, researchers' conceptions of particular concepts have changed over time. This is the speeding train problem, flybys of each piece of literature, little or no analysis. A flyby is, what an airplane does when it kind of zooms past, right? And that's the metaphor of the speeding train, where you just kind of talk about one piece of literature for a short time, and then you move on to another one, and you move on to another one, and you don't help the reader kind of consolidate what's important, or to extract what's important out of that literature and put it in some kind of summary form. Too many dated references, and the current work is missing. And that can be a problem. Very often there are, I would call, kind of trends in research, where at a particular period of time, there'll be a lot of work done in a particular area, and then it fades away for some reason. And so it might be hard to find more current literature, but that's also an indication that you need to understand why it faded away. Because in some cases, research kind of traditions tend to fade away because people feel either that research tradition isn't going anywhere, the way people are approaching the research isn't working, and they're not really discovering anything new that people are going to be interested in. Or it may be that the research has come up with enough answers that people are ready to move on to some other question. That second one can be problematic for your study if your committee believes that Well, we already know the answer to that question. Why is it that you want to explore that question if in the literature you can already find reasonable answers that have been produced using responsible research methods? Okay. Missing pieces of key or closely related literature. Sometimes you'll be working in one area of literature, and you will realize, or a committee member might suggest, that you look at a related body of literature that is defined a bit differently, but they see a connection between that body of literature and what you're working on. So you need to be open to the possibility of finding these other connections. And often these will be suggested in the literature itself. You'll see people referring to related areas of work and bringing it into their own work that you would then need to follow up on if you want to get a good sense of how that area of research has evolved. Incomplete or missing synthesis, leaving the work to readers. And again, that's where I get a little bit cross with students if they expect me to make sense of what they're writing instead of them making sense of it for me, so that I can kind of see whether I agree with their analysis and how they're drawing from that literature what they regard as important for their study. Weakly argued or missing conclusions. I've been reading some literature reviews from some doctoral students that are in a course I'm doing this term, and one of my frequent comments at the end is, "This ends rather abruptly." And by that I mean, we're talking about literature, and then all of a sudden they stop and they think that's the end of the literature review. And when I say abruptly, I'm expecting there to be a clear kind of conclusion, summary, some other way that they help me reflect back on all that they've just talked about and what elements of it are especially important for the work as they move forward. Okay? And then a weak or missing authorial voice. We want to hear your voice. Students are tempted to rely on the critiques of others, for example, in literature reviews, and you can certainly include those in your literature review, but we also want to know what you think of these ideas. So we want to hear your voice in addition to the voice of other people who are critiquing the literature that you're looking at. Okay? Now, I want to talk about some resources. These are a lot of different ideas to think about. There are resources, quite a few resources available that you can look at if you're interested in digging a bit deeper. The UBC Library has this webpage. Any of you looked at this webpage? Yeah. So they have some good guides, a comprehensive guide designed for students preparing for thesis, graduating papers, and so on. So they too define literature reviews and provide other resources that you might find helpful. Other universities, like the University of Toronto, has a similar set of tips available, again, defining what they mean by literature review and so on. We may not agree with all of the things they say here, especially the notion of an annotated bibliography, but I think generally people don't regard an annotated bibliography as a literature review. It's just a step on the way to a literature review. I ran across this recently. This is a professor at the University of Calgary, and she has some very strong views that she talks about on her website here about what kind of resources to include. And I've highlighted from her article this kind of framework. So again, this is her hierarchy of sources, and it's good to talk with your supervisor, your instructors, the other people who are going to be looking at your work about what kind of sources they view as credible and whether there are any that to them are kind of off limits. So the most respected, as she indicates here, peer-reviewed scholarly and scientific journal articles from reputable publishers, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. Peer-reviewed conference proceedings, books from highly credible publishing houses, official government or public agency sources, documentation from highly credible non-governmental organizations. She gives examples of each one of these as well. An example of the last one there, highly credible non-governmental organizations, would be UNESCO World Bank, those kind of organizations that have lots of resources and they have a very rigorous review process before they put out any publications and so on. Okay to use in moderation, credible edited professional journals, conference proceedings that may not necessarily be refereed, white papers from well-respected think tanks or research institutes. A white paper is usually an effort to try to discuss in some depth a particular kind of issue. Sometimes they include making policy proposals and so on. But it is important to look very carefully at the background of the organization that produced the material to see whether they're credible, whether they have a particular philosophical slant, and so on. So it's important to understand how the character of the organization might influence what they say and the kind of assessments that they do in a particular area of work. Use sparingly sources from highly reputable news channels. And so those would be things like well-regarded newspapers, magazines, kind of the sites of places like Cable News Network or the BBC or the CBC and so on.
Fox.
Yeah, Fox. Again, it's important to understand the philosophical, ideological kind of influences that might determine, how a particular organization frames things, including the ones I just mentioned. Avoid altogether non-scholarly sources, including but not limited to, and this got covered up by my picture, Wikipedia. And the interesting thing about Wikipedia is that you probably noticed that it's often the first thing that pops up, right? If you ask for a definition or you put a term in, and there are reasons why it pops up. But what I usually recommend to students is that it's okay to start with Wikipedia, but never stop at Wikipedia. See what Wikipedia says, and sometimes they do have some references that take you to other sources and so on. But especially when it comes to definitions, I would never rely on Wikipedia. When I was doing my graduate work, the kind of standard for definitions of terms was the Oxford English Dictionary. And in those days, when I was studying, doing my graduate work, the library had this huge have any of you ever seen the physical Oxford English Dictionary? You probably haven't. You're all too young for that. They were so big, the volumes were so big that they had special rollers to store them on in most libraries. They were huge, but they really trace the evolution of the English language. And they'll have like dozens of different meanings of terms if they find those different meanings in the world of literature. But these days, and the Oxford English Dictionary actually is available online these days, as is the Canadian sources and so on. So it's important to kind of look at different sources if what you're going after is definitions. Quotation websites, she says to avoid. Articles from predatory journals. Now up above when it says highly credible publishing houses, there are journals, there are book publishers these days that are regarded, what we call them are predatory publishers. And all of us who are academics and have our names on academic websites get invitations constantly to put papers into these journals. Very often they will charge a publishing fee, and so they're usually for-profit journals. They say they're refereed because they know that that's important for academics to publish in, but very often they either aren't or it's so superficial that a lot of stuff gets out there that really hasn't been looked at very closely. So both books and articles might find their way into these predatory journals. And so it's important to kind of, as you're doing your review, you will probably see and get an understanding of what the more credible sources are that you're looking at. But even if you find a book that's relevant, it's important to kind of go on the web and find out what the background is on the publisher of that book. Okay? And if you ask any individual faculty member, they may come up with a different set of categories here. But I think everyone would agree that you never kind of start and end with things like Wikipedia. And you need to make sure that things have been reviewed in some rigorous way by people who know what they're talking about. Okay. Now, there are also books, quite a few books actually, on doing literature reviews, and each of them will have different approaches. The one on the left there, they talk about 6 steps to success, and so they use a stepwise fashion. The other one, step-by-step guide for students, releasing the research imagination, doing a literature review by Chris Hart, systematic approaches to a successful literature review, and so on. So these are available. Many of them have been in multiple editions, as you can see here. And so if you want to get some more advice, if you find one of these that's particularly attractive to you because of the way they approach it, then you can use it as a guide as well. These are a couple more. Writing literature review, a practical guide, doing traditional and systematic techniques. Okay. Now, I want to talk about some others. So those are the book sources for doing literature reviews. But there are also some journals that specialize in publishing literature reviews. And these can be very instructive to look at because these tend to be the most demanding of writers when you submit a literature review for publication. If you're lucky, you could be working in an area where somebody has already done a literature review, right? And that could identify for you, especially if it's a recent one, it could identify some of the questions that you have, like, who are the most frequently cited authors, and how is this area being framed and researched today? And in some cases, the review will also be it'll have a historical component to it, so you can kind of answer the question, where have these ideas come from and how have they changed over time? The Review of Research in Education, it's a publication of the American Educational Research Association, so if you go on their website, you can see this, and all major university libraries will have access to this as well. These are 2 special issues, and the Review of Research in Education is a thematic set. It's an annual thematic review, and so each of these, as you can see on the cover, has a particular orientation. So the one from 2017 was Disrupting Inequality Through Educational Research, and you can see the other one. And so you might find one of these annual collections that has relevance for your work as well. And generally, these are very well written, very rigorously reviewed reviews of research. Another publication of the AERA, and this gets a little confusing. As you can see on the left there, this one is the Review of Educational Research. Down below it is the Review of Research in Education. And so the difference is that the Review of Research in Education is an annual volume that's on a particular topic. The Review of Educational Research has different reviews in it each time it's published. It's bi-monthly, okay? And again, the Review of Educational Research, you might also be able to find something that's relevant to the work that you're doing. So be sure to have a look at that one if you haven't already run across it. This is one from Europe, and I'm going to show you kind of an extreme example of structuring and the criteria for assessing a literature review. So this is Educational Research Review. It can be very confusing very quickly, all the different titles that include research review in it. And I'll show you why I picked this one. So this is, again, the editor here is from Germany. So this is one of the articles that I ran across in this particular journal. And so it was interesting because I thought this was mostly related to medical and health work that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, this process. But this one, 4 key challenges to the design of blended learning, a systematic literature review. And so this focuses on something that we've been very interested in education as technology has come into play. Is what are the challenges, what are the impacts, what are the best practices in terms of blended learning where you're mixing face-to-face usually with technology. Now, if you look at the part that's highlighted here, you can see where these authors have identified, they provided some information here on how they went about selecting the literature. Okay, this is in the abstract, so they probably elaborate on this a bit in the body of the work as well. So starting from 640 sources, 20 studies on the design of blended learning environments were selected through a staged procedure based on the guidelines of the PRISMA statement. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, using predefined selection criteria. And then they go on to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm highlighting here one of the elements of a good literature review, and that is that you tell people how you went about identifying literature. Okay. Now, what's this thing called the PRISMA statement? I didn't know what that was when I ran across this. I'd never heard of it before. So I went to the PRISMA website. And it was very interesting. So PRISMA stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. Okay, now, as they say there, they're really looking at primarily medicine and health-related issues where you often hear in the media, for example, that there's been a meta-analysis or some review done in order for somebody to make a decision about a health policy. And it might have to do, for example, with whether the province of British Columbia is going to pay for a certain medication. And they want to make sure that that medication is safe and effective and so on. So they do a review of the studies that have been done on it. So that's what I thought that this protocol was about. But this obviously was a study that was grounded in education, and they refer to this PRISMA statement. And then I went further onto their website, and I found this article. So it talks a little bit about PRISMA, and as you can see there, it talks about studies that evaluate healthcare interventions. So that's their primary orientation. And then I went further, and I found this. And this was really interesting because this particular kind of template has, I think, about 3 pages of criteria that need to be included if you're going to use this framework as the basis for a literature review. So they're very specific here because they want these reviews because they can be very impactful and have serious economic health consequences and so on. They want these reviews to be done with a high degree of quality. And so as you can see here, they have things, and this is how you have to write up these reviews. And if you're interested, you can go to this website, prismastatement.org, up there at the top, and see what they have to say. And it might give you some ideas about your own literature review. Okay. Now, the other thing I've highlighted here is it talks about the results. And again, this is an abstract, but this basically is just another example why it's important to, in a literature review, to have conclusions, to have a summary, to be able to tell people at the end what we know based on the literature that we've looked at, okay? And especially in your own voice. Now, I think we have enough time left that I want to tell a little personal lit review story because I think part of the description of this little session was that doing literature reviews can actually be a part of your career development, and it can influence the direction your career takes. And so I want to talk about that a little bit from my own personal history. It may come off as bragging a little bit, but it's the best example that I had of how a literature review can kind of influence how people view you in the field and what you're invited to do later in your career and so on. So, as you can see here, this is a publication that I wrote with a colleague that was published in Adult Education Quarterly in 1986. A lot of the work that I do is in the area of what in adult education we call program planning. My colleague, John Buskey, he was a colleague of mine at the University of Nebraska before I came up here to UBC. He and I were both very interested in the program planning process as we tend to talk about it in North America. And we had both read a lot of literature and we wanted to say some critical things about that literature, but we felt that our credibility would be at stake. We had to actually demonstrate to people that we had looked at the literature carefully enough that that our comments would be viewed as informed and legitimate, our critiques essentially. And so we decided to do a literature review, an historical one over this 33-year period in those days from 1950 to 1983. Now, to highlight a couple of things, so we also indicated kind of what this review was about and how we selected the literature. So this particular review included 93 publications consisting of book length and shorter pieces which contained an explicit or implicit planning model. Okay? And then we talked a little bit about how we went about presenting this. We used kind of a Consumer Reports way of summarizing this literature because it wasn't really possible in the space of a journal article to do it in a completely narrative form. Okay? Now, as you can see, we weren't specific about what our findings were, but we did give the reader a heads up in the abstract when we said several observations about the current state of the program planning literature are made and recommendations designed to strengthen the literature are offered. Now, what did we conclude from our analysis? Well, just to show you what were some of the things we were able to say, there's a lack of cross-referencing and absence of cumulative development. So authors tended to write in isolation of all the other work that was being done, especially in different sectors of adult education. And we thought it was important to say that. People might be writing in one sector and they were saying the same things that somebody in another sector was saying, and there wasn't any recognition that other people were working in the same area. As a whole, the literature has a low degree of theoretical explanation. That was a key critique of ours, that there was a lot of how to do it literature, what kind of planning models and so on, but they really never provided any kind of theoretical or conceptual basis for what they were talking about. Few books treat planning in a comprehensive fashion. Many of these authors would just pick fairly maybe well-defined areas, but there were a lot of kind of incomplete aspects of planning in our view that weren't treated. That the models that we were looking at vary more due to contextual differences than substantive differences in process. So when we looked at this literature, we said, well, there are a lot of similarities here, and the differences are really accounted for by the kind of audience that the writer had in mind and what the kind of organizational setting the person was in that was looking at this model. A heavy bias toward planning involving, in this case, face-to-face or group instruction, rather than more individualized or even technology-based instruction. This was in the pre-web days, but there was still quite a bit of distance education going on using correspondence instruction and that kind of thing. And finally, the roles played and proficiencies required by those who plan are not addressed in most models, And so these models really didn't speak to what you need to know and what sensitivities you need to have, what skills you need to develop if you're going to be an effective planner. Okay, so this was, we are in this field, we were critical, we pointed out a few cases where we offered specific examples to illustrate the points that we were making here. Now, because we published this, the first thing that happened that we noticed very quickly is that planning models books about planning in adult education that were published after that picked up on our critique. And so a lot of these authors they added an initial chapter where they looked at other planning models and other literature. And so we started to see greater attention given to this broader range of models that were out there so that people weren't just duplicating one another's work. Now, this led in 1989 to me being asked, along with another colleague, to write a chapter in what is known as the Handbook of Adult and Continuing Education. Now, every 10 years, the National Association based in the US puts out one of these handbooks, and the chapters in the handbook are intended to kind of look over the most recent 10 years since the last handbook was published and to bring people up to date on work in that area. So Rosemary Caprell and I did this chapter in 1989, and I was invited partly because of the work that John Buskey and I did. The people in the field knew that we had looked pretty carefully at the literature during that decade, and so I was invited to be part of this. And then the 2000 handbook came along, and Rosemary wasn't part of it, but I was asked to write the chapter on program planning. So I then looked from 1989 to 2000 on what had happened and tried to kind of do a critique and to bring out ideas and so on. And then, so now, for some people, this would probably be viewed as a real pain, right? That you keep getting asked to do these things, but you have the choice to say no. But if you're working in an area and you've developed a reputation in that area, it can really help your career. And I've been on thesis committees, dissertation committees, where the committee encourages the student to publish their literature review in addition to their full study. But the literature review can often be a freestanding contribution because the student has done such a good job in pulling together and critiquing work in an area that nobody has really looked at in the same way before. So that can be a very effective kind of strategy. So program planning is the area that I've done most of my work in, but I've also done work in the area of professional ethics. So in 2009, I was also asked to write a chapter on applied ethics in adult and continuing education and the literature that had developed around that topic. So if you're viewed as a capable literature review writer, that you don't miss too many things. That's the first thing. There's always the fear that you're going to miss something that you should have found when you're doing this kind of a review. And you have a reasonably accessible writing style and these publications are designed for both academics but also practitioners. Then you might get invitations to do this kind of thing. So think of your literature review as a possible launching pad if you want to continue to work in the area that you're studying, as a launching pad for making a name for yourself in a particular area and getting your work out there, and then you might get invited to do some other things. Okay? So I think we have a few minutes left. I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have about anything I've said here today. Yes.
So last week I was looking at a paper that wasn't what they call a primary source research paper. So there was no actual study involved, right? So somebody, one of my instructors called it a theory paper. So is a theory paper like a literature review?
I think it depends on what the character of the theory paper is. I think that you can certainly include theory papers. They don't have to be like empirical studies that are the basis for your literature review. You could include conceptual work, you could include theoretical work, and that might be one part of your literature review, and then you might get around to maybe more empirical work at another point in your literature review.
Okay, so a literature review could include theory papers.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be empirical work. I think it's important. In some areas, it's really important to look at conceptual changes over time. How has a particular area been reframed? Has the language changed? Has the terminology changed over time, and so on?
Okay.
Yeah.
How long did it take you from first searching the first literature until finish that writing the legendary literature?
This is the original one from
Yeah.
1986. Well, I don't want to discourage you. John Buskey and I were both at the University of Nebraska. I left there in 1981 to come to Vancouver. This was published in 1984, I think it was. Yeah, 1984. And so, but I was a new faculty member here. I was trying to, I moved up here. I was distracted by other things. And so it took us a while to get this published. But we probably spent a year gathering together the literature, making sure we each had copies of everything. And then we set up, if you read the article, you would see that we wanted to each assess the literature independently. So we set up this analytical framework. And then we each went through the literature ourselves, and then we had to pull our two decisions together. So we had decision-making rules to arrive at final kind of classifications for the literature. So yeah, that took at least a year off and on of a lot of reading and analysis. And then we had to get together to kind of bring our separate decisions together and make a final decision. So there was, it was, I don't know if any of you read Consumer Reports, but one of the unique features of this that really hasn't been very influential, and there was one other article published that used the same kind of framework, is that if you go to Consumer Reports and you want to buy a car, for example, they'll have a list of all the cars that each manufacturer makes, and then they have a whole bunch of criteria over here that they've assessed those cars on. And they have ratings, and they often use symbols to indicate, low, medium, high, and so on. And so we use that idea, and that hasn't caught on, but it was an effective way in a short space, in a short article, of indicating what the elements were of planning that were addressed by each model. So we had descriptive dimensions of the model, and then we had evaluative dimensions, especially around kind of theoretical underpinnings and those kind of things. Yeah.
I guess my question is mostly around methods of doing that. So, are there any softwares that you would recommend? I've worked on doing literature reviews. Produced reports with one of my co-supervisors and another colleague. We did a lot of literature reviews. We used Excel. We created tables of that and came up with themes and kind of tried to divide the articles based on those themes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But now I know that people are using in vivo and other kind of softwares to help them organize.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your suggestions or?
I'm not going to recommend any particular software or platform for this, mainly because I think it really depends on your purpose and what the learning curve is. And Vivo can be used for lots of other things in addition to the literature review part. And so, what is it that you want to use it for? What learning curve is going to be involved in learning how to use it well? And I think the library has sessions on a lot of these, and they have information sheets on the different kind of reference management systems and so on. So it depends on how sophisticated you want the platform to be, whether you just want it to basically be a reference manager, or whether you want to look for thematic ideas and be able to pull out quotations and those kind of things. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, seminar today. As a graduate student, one of the challenging things for me, theory or research question. What I mean, there are so many books I want to read, or sometimes I must to read. However, we have very limited energy and time, right? So when we want to develop our big research question as a budding scholar, but we should finish first our doctorate thesis first as a part of that big research question, right? So for me, literature review kind of entry point to enter this field of scholarship, right? So why my research could be different or novel from previous research so far. So sometimes I would to feel like I'm lost in the theory or too much things to read as a literature review. So as an entry point to get into this scholar world, what would you recommend to do as a research review? For example, Adult Education Quarterly, or so what I mean, North American literature review main thing and European thing, and I'm from Asia, so Asian review kind of thing. So doing this literature review, I should find out who would be my future audience of my thesis, right?
Well, yeah, at a certain point you'll have a committee, right,
of course.
for your thesis and you can talk with them about what their expectations are. That could certainly be part of it. But I think you were asking about where do you start or what do you focus on? Is that part of it?
You can recommend specific journals, up to your research question, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I
want to hear your personal case.
Yeah. Well, it's in my field of adult education, there are probably half a dozen well-regarded journals internationally that you could look at. You know the ones in Asia that I don't know, and you could decide which one of those are the ones that are the most respected journals in the field. But I think it does depend on your question, where you go. But I think starting with the journals that are directly in your field, where people understand your interest and the kind of topic that you're going to pursue is the best way to begin, because the ones that are most recent will have references to earlier work, and it's important to use the references that other people refer to help you kind of continue your research, especially to extend it back and to find out where the influences have come from. And you've probably heard this advice too, that you'll begin to see the same names pop up over and over again when you're working in a particular area, and these are the people who have been influential. It doesn't mean they're beyond critique, especially because their ideas may be a little outmoded, but you'll see the names that are mentioned frequently, and you can then kind of trace back the work that those people have done. So I think starting with the core journals, and again, going back to that list of kind of the quality level, look at journals, look at books that focus in that area, and often there'll be a collection, an edited collection, and the people who are well known in that area will have been invited to submit chapters in that book and so on. So that's another way to identify what some of the more recent ones are. So I would concentrate on journals and the high quality books that have been assembled produced by good publishers. Yeah.
I wasn't sure, maybe I missed it, where you would, show your cards, your positionality in your literature review.
Usually, I think it depends where your positionality shows up would depend on what piece of writing you're doing. If you're doing a freestanding literature review, then I would expect that to show up in the early parts, the early paragraphs of the literature review. And if you're bringing a particular theoretical or philosophical orientation to the analysis, it would also be important when you're talking about how you selected the literature to be upfront about that this particular orientation influenced your decisions about which literature to look at and which literature to exclude. So I think that would be fine. If it's in a thesis, you're gonna declare your positionality probably in the first chapter, right, rather than in the literature review. So people would know right at the outset how you're positioning yourself and your work in relation to kind of a philosophical or a theoretical orientation. Yeah.
I was reading about an approach to doing a literature review where you don't actually have a literature review section. You put your literature review in each section of the. What are your thoughts on that? So let's say you do a literature review on methodology, for example, right? So what's your thoughts on that?
If you're doing a literature review that focuses on methodology, then I would expect that to be in a methodology chapter rather than a literature review chapter. Although, if you're looking at empirical studies, quantitative or qualitative, in your literature review, it would be important to at least talk a bit about the methodology that's being used in that work, okay? The methodology, the literature you would include in your methodology chapter would speak specifically to the elements of methodology that you're going to be employing in your study, right?
Yeah.
And part of your argument may be that you're going to use a different methodology than all these other people who have looked at this problem because it hasn't really produced the kind of useful information that you think it would be produced by a different approach.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'd have a literature review section in your methodology typically as well, right? Or
yeah,
at least like a sort of just a very brief or.
Well, again, your methodology chapter, you're trying to demonstrate to your committee and eventually to the reader that you know what you're doing in terms of the methodology, that you know what the principles are, the kind of epistemological, ontological assumptions of particular methodologies, the kind of technical issues in relation to methodology, the ethical issues in relation to the methodology, and so on. And I should have responded too to the to the question you asked, or the point you made before, that there may not be a clearly defined literature review in some dissertations or theses, and that's true. You can get locked into the notion of a 5 or 6 chapter thesis or dissertation, and most of us would say, and the literature review is usually the second chapter, follows an introduction, literature review, and then the methodology and so on. That's kind of a traditional thesis structure. But there are lots of examples here in ed studies and in other parts of the faculty where people do unconventional theses and they organize them in unconventional ways. The important point is that you weave into the thesis, however it's organized, the literature that's relevant to the parts you're talking about in that chapter or in that section. And so I wouldn't say that you always have to have a chapter called literature review, as long as you're weaving that literature in at the appropriate places and are sufficiently critical about it and provide the synthesis and so on. I mean, there's been, people have there's been at least one case I know of where somebody wrote a novel for a dissertation here. And it was really fascinating how they incorporated theory and research into this novel. It was very clever the way they did it, and yet it was a novel, right? And so, and there are lots of other examples of unconventionally organized theses and dissertations where people figure out a way to weave the literature into chapters that have different kinds of titles. So don't feel constrained by the conventional structure of a thesis. On the other hand, you're adding to the complexity if you're going to come up with a unique structure of your thesis. And you might have to convince your committee to come along on the ride if you're going to do something that doesn't fall into the usual pattern. But there are lots of examples of creative organization of theses, and most faculty members are quite willing to consider an alternative to the conventional. But I think we're probably out of time, and I think some of you may have to go to class, right, at 4:30. I don't know.
Thank you
Anyway.
so much, Don. Really appreciate it. A lot of really critical insights.
Really.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Yeah, you bring it different, because I've gone to library presentations and they're good, but it's a different focus.
Yeah. So
it was good to sort of get it from an actual instructor's perspective too.
Well, good.
Yeah.
That was helpful. Thank you.